My child, I want you to stay with me for a while, because what I am about to say deserves more than a passing glance. Something in your life has been quietly asking for your attention, and I do not want you to keep moving past it the way you may have moved past it on so many other days already. You did not arrive at this message by pure accident. Something quieter than chance drew your attention here, at this exact point in your life. And I want you to trust that pull rather than dismiss it as nothing. It is not nothing. It is the beginning of something you have needed to hear for longer than you have admitted, even to yourself. I want to speak honestly about what you have been carrying, because I do not think you have let many people see the full size of it. You have smiled through days when something heavier sat underneath. You have shown up for responsibilities while feeling genuinely depleted. You have carried concerns too complicated to explain in a single sentence. And you have done most of it quietly, without complaint. Because you did not want to become a burden to the people around you. I want you to know that none of that has gone unnoticed. You have not been distant from the eyes that matter, even in your hardest, most tired moments. Difficulty has a way of stripping away everything except the most honest parts of a person. And honesty, even when unpolished and full of doubt, is worth paying attention to. I want to talk about the specific things that once looked like an ending in your life. Moments that felt final, situations that seemed to close every door at once. Disappointments that convinced you a particular chapter was simply over and nothing good could come from it. I want you to consider something today that may reframe how you have understood those moments. What looked like an ending was very often not actually the end of your story. It was the end of a chapter that needed to close so that a different one could begin. One you could not yet see the shape of, from where you were standing at the time. I know that is a difficult thing to hear when you are still in the middle of genuine pain, and I do not want to minimize how hard certain seasons have actually been. Some losses are simply losses, genuinely painful without an obvious silver lining attached to them. I am not going to pretend that every difficult ending in your life was secretly a blessing in careful disguise. That would not be honest. And I would rather tell you the truth than offer you a comforting oversimplification that eventually rings hollow. But I do want you to consider that not every difficult ending was purely destructive. Some of it was making room, even amid the genuine pain, for something that needed the space your old circumstances were occupying. A relationship that ended, painfully, may have been quietly holding you back from growth you needed to experience. A plan that fell apart, disappointing you deeply, may have led you somewhere considerably less suited to who you are actually becoming. A version of yourself, an old set of assumptions or old patterns, may have needed to be genuinely shaken before you were willing to release it, even though releasing it was ultimately necessary for your own well-being. I want to speak now about what has actually been happening beneath the surface of your life during this long, difficult stretch, because I think you deserve to understand it more clearly, rather than simply being told to keep waiting without explanation. You have developed a deeper capacity for patience than you likely had before this season began. You have developed a clearer sense of what actually matters to you, refined through the process of losing or nearly losing things you once took for granted. You have developed resilience specifically through continuing to function even when circumstances offered very little visible encouragement to do so. I want you to understand that these developments are not separate from whatever comes next in your life. They are the actual foundation that makes receiving and sustaining something genuinely good possible. A person who has not developed real capacity for patience, real clarity about their own values, real resilience under pressure, often struggles to hold on to good things, even when those good things finally arrive, because they have not yet built what is needed to sustain them. You have been building that capacity, whether you fully realized it or not, throughout this entire difficult season. I want to talk honestly about doubt because I suspect there have been moments throughout this difficult stretch when you privately wondered whether you were simply failing, whether your continued struggle meant you had somehow done something wrong to deserve it, or whether things were simply never going to improve no matter how much effort you continued to put in. I want to address that doubt directly. Struggling through genuine difficulty is not evidence of failure. It is simply an honest response to genuinely difficult circumstances. The fact that you have continued functioning, continued showing up, continued trying despite that doubt says something important about you that the doubt itself completely fails to capture. I want to speak now about what it actually means for something that once broke you to become the very thing that eventually strengthens you. Because I do not want this to remain simply a comforting phrase without any real substance behind it. When something in your life has been shattered, whether through loss, betrayal, or simply the painful ending of a season that had run its course, that shattering is not automatically the final word on what that experience means for your life. It can also become, over time, the specific place where you developed a strength, a clarity, or a depth of compassion that would not have existed the same way without that particular difficulty. I want you to consider the specific things that have broken in your own life during this difficult season. Perhaps trust that was broken by someone who betrayed it. Perhaps confidence that was broken by repeated failure or rejection. Perhaps a sense of safety that was broken by circumstances entirely outside your control. I am not going to tell you that the breaking itself was good, or that you should be grateful for the pain it caused. Grief and anger over genuine betrayal or genuine loss deserve to be honored as legitimate responses, not immediately reframed into gratitude before you have had the chance to actually feel them fully. But I do want you to consider what has actually grown in the space that breaking created. Sometimes a broken trust teaches a person genuine discernment they did not have before, an ability to recognize the difference between people who are trustworthy and people who only appear that way. Sometimes broken confidence, rebuilt slowly and honestly, becomes considerably more solid than confidence that was never actually tested. Sometimes a broken sense of safety, restored gradually through real effort, teaches a person to recognize and appreciate genuine safety in a way they could not have appreciated it before experiencing its absence. I want to talk now about what specifically might already be beginning to shift in your life as a result of everything you have endured, because I do not want this message to remain entirely abstract. You may notice gradually a growing sense of clarity about decisions that previously felt confusing or overwhelming. You may notice relationships shifting, some deepening as people who genuinely value you become more visible, others naturally fading as they no longer fit the direction your life is beginning to move toward. You may notice opportunities appearing that specifically require the kind of resilience and patience you have already developed through this difficult season. Situations where your particular capacity for enduring hardship with grace becomes genuinely valuable rather than simply something you privately endured. I want you to pay attention to these shifts as they begin appearing, not with anxious scrutiny that examines every small development for proof that everything has changed, but with a kind of quiet readiness that simply notices and receives what arrives without demanding it conform to a specific dramatic shape. Genuine transformation rarely announces itself with a single, unmistakable moment of complete resolution. It tends to arrive gradually through smaller signs accumulating over time, until eventually you look back and realize how much has actually shifted from where you once stood. I want to speak about comparison for a moment, because I suspect you have occasionally wondered why other people's difficult seasons seem to resolve more quickly, or why their painful experiences seem to transform into visible growth more rapidly than yours has so far. I want to address that comparison directly. Other people's timelines are not a measure of your own worth or your own eventual outcome. What has been quietly building in you through this difficult season does not need to match anyone else's visible progress in order to eventually matter in your own life, in your own time, in a way specifically suited to what you have actually developed through this particular stretch of difficulty. I want to speak honestly about the specific loneliness that can accompany a long, difficult season, especially when the people around you do not fully understand what you have actually been carrying. There is a particular kind of isolation in continuing to function through genuine difficulty, while others around you seem unaware of its full weight. I want you to know that this loneliness is real, and I do not want to minimize it. But I also want you to know that this particular season of quiet, sometimes solitary endurance is building something in you that will eventually connect you with other people who share that same capacity. People who will recognize in you something they have also had to develop through their own difficult seasons. I want to talk now about what it means to keep functioning, even when you cannot fully explain why you are still trying. There is a kind of perseverance that operates primarily through clear motivation, a person who keeps going because they can see exactly why it matters and exactly what they are working toward. There is another kind of perseverance that continues even when that clear motivation has become genuinely difficult to access. A perseverance that persists simply because something in you refuses to fully stop, even without being able to fully explain why that refusal feels necessary. You have been operating from that second kind of perseverance throughout much of this difficult season. And I want you to know that this kind of endurance, though harder to articulate and defend logically, often proves more durable than perseverance built entirely on clear, visible motivation, precisely because it does not depend on circumstances remaining encouraging in order to continue. I want to speak about the specific fear that this difficult season might somehow never actually end, that you might simply be exhausted indefinitely without any real resolution ever arriving. I want to address that fear honestly rather than dismissing it. I cannot promise you an exact timeline for when specific circumstances will resolve. Life does not always move at the pace we would choose if we were designing it ourselves. But I want you to understand that seasons, by their very nature, are not permanent conditions. Even the longest, hardest seasons eventually give way to something different, even when it is genuinely difficult to imagine that shift while you are still standing in the middle of the difficulty. I want to talk now about gratitude, not as an obligation, but as something genuinely useful as you continue moving through this season. Gratitude tends to widen a person's capacity to notice good things as they actually arrive, rather than remaining so fixated on what has not yet resolved that the things which have already begun shifting go unnoticed. I want to invite you to notice, honestly, whatever small signs of change might already be present in your life right now, even if they feel modest compared to what you might be hoping for eventually. I want to speak plainly about self-compassion as well, because I suspect you have been considerably harder on yourself throughout this difficult season than you would ever be towards someone else, enduring the exact same circumstances. If someone else had walked through everything you have walked through, continuing to function despite genuine exhaustion, continuing to show up despite real discouragement, you would likely admire them without hesitation. I want you to consider extending that same admiration toward yourself, rather than continuing to minimize what your own endurance has actually required and accomplished. I want to talk about rest now, because I think you have likely postponed it more than you should have, believing that continuing to push through meant never fully acknowledging how tired this season has actually made you. Rest is not a betrayal of your perseverance. It is what allows that perseverance to continue sustainably, rather than eventually collapsing under its own accumulated weight. I want you to give yourself permission to actually rest, not as something you have to earn through more suffering, but simply as a necessary part of continuing to be who you have already shown yourself capable of being. I want to speak now about the specific relief that comes from finally sensing that this particular difficulty is beginning to pass. That relief tends to arrive gradually rather than all at once, through an accumulation of smaller confirmations rather than one single dramatic turning point. I want you to remain open to receiving that relief in whatever form it actually takes, rather than narrowing your expectation down to only one specific shape it must arrive in to count as genuine. I want to talk about the people who may not fully understand or acknowledge what this season has actually required of you, because I do not want to promise you universal recognition that may not actually arrive from every direction. Some people, even now, may continue underestimating what enduring genuine difficulty has cost you internally. I want you to know that this does not diminish the reality of what you have built through this season. Recognition from every single person was never the actual measure of whether your struggle mattered. It mattered independently of universal acknowledgement, and it continues to matter even from the people who may never fully understand what it required of you. I want to speak now about what practical steps might look like as you continue moving through and eventually beyond this difficult season. First, continue extending yourself the same patience you would extend to someone else in your exact circumstances. It is easy to hold yourself to a standard of unwavering strength that you would never actually expect from anyone else facing the same difficulty. Release that unreasonable standard, at least a little, as you continue moving forward. Second, allow yourself to actually notice and receive good developments when they arrive, rather than immediately searching for reasons to doubt them or brace against their eventual disappearance. There is a difference between healthy discernment and reflexive suspicion born from prolonged difficulty. When something good genuinely arrives, let yourself receive it fully rather than immediately assuming it will be taken away. Third, continue extending grace to yourself during moments you inevitably still struggle, even as circumstances begin to improve. A difficult season rarely ends with a single clean break from difficulty entirely. It simply means continuing to notice more good moments accumulating alongside the remaining hard ones, rather than requiring every single day to feel completely resolved before you allow yourself to acknowledge that things are genuinely shifting. Fourth, remain patient with the pace at which the fuller resolution of this season actually unfolds. I know enduring this difficulty has already cost you a great deal, and I do not want to suggest that further patience, even as things begin improving, is simple or easy. But genuine, lasting resolution tends to arrive gradually rather than instantly, built on an accumulated foundation rather than a single dramatic moment. Trust that foundation rather than needing immediate, complete proof that everything has shifted all at once. I want to speak now about the specific fear that even after this difficulty passes, another one might simply follow close behind it, making the relief feel temporary or even pointless to fully embrace. I want to address that fear honestly. It is true that life continues to include difficulty, and I am not going to promise you a future entirely free of hard seasons, because that would not be an honest promise to make. But I want you to understand that the resilience you have built through this particular season does not disappear once this particular season passes. It remains available to you strengthened rather than depleted, ready to be drawn upon again if and when future difficulty arrives. I want to talk now about identity for a moment, because I think a great deal of what has sustained you through this difficult season connects back to a clear, steady sense of who you actually are, separate from how circumstances have treated you along the way. Circumstances shift constantly, sometimes improving quickly, sometimes remaining difficult for a much longer stretch than felt fair or reasonable. But the core of who you actually are has remained steady beneath all of that shifting. And that steadiness is precisely what allowed you to continue functioning even when circumstances offered very little encouragement to do so. I want to speak about community as well, because I think enduring a genuine difficulty can sometimes feel deeply isolating, especially when the people around you do not share the same depth of difficulty or do not fully understand what you have been carrying. Even a small amount of genuine connection with someone who recognizes and shares that same quality of endurance can meaningfully lighten the sense of isolation that this particular kind of struggle sometimes produces. If you have felt alone in maintaining this level of perseverance, consider that connection with people who share similar depth may be part of what the eventual passing of this season brings toward you. I want to close this extended reflection by speaking directly to whatever specific doubt is loudest in you right now. In this exact moment, as you continue reading, whatever that particular doubt is, whether it concerns whether this difficulty will actually pass, whether your endurance actually mattered, or whether you have truly understood what this season required of you. That doubt does not have final authority over what is actually true about your life. Doubt is persistent, and it often feels convincing, but it is not always accurate, and it does not change what has genuinely been built in you across this long, difficult season. So take one more slow breath before you close this message and move forward into whatever comes next in your day. You have endured something genuinely difficult for a long time, often without external confirmation, often at real internal cost. Something is genuinely allowed to shift now, even quietly, even gradually, even before you can fully see every piece of what has already begun changing around you. And you are allowed to let yourself believe that, one honest day at a time. I want to talk more specifically now about what a genuine ending actually tends to look like in practice, because I think concrete detail can be more useful than abstract reassurance alone. It often begins with small moments of unexpected relief scattered through otherwise ordinary days, a conversation that goes better than expected, a task that feels slightly less overwhelming than similar tasks have felt recently, an evening where you notice you actually laughed without forcing it. These moments do not usually announce themselves as the beginning of the end of a difficult season. They simply arrive quietly, and only in hindsight does their pattern become clear. I want you to hold space for the possibility that some of those small moments may have already begun appearing in your life, even if you have not yet connected them together into a larger, more hopeful pattern. Sometimes, a person is in the middle of genuine improvement without fully recognizing it, because they are still bracing so heavily against the possibility of further difficulty that they have not yet allowed themselves to notice the shift already underway. I want to speak honestly about the specific exhaustion of constant bracing, the habit of expecting the worst before anything even happens, simply so the eventual letdown will not hit as hard if it comes. You have probably built some version of that habit over the course of this difficult season, and I understand exactly why. It made sense as a way to survive repeated disappointment, but I want you to notice something about that habit now. As circumstances potentially begin to shift, the very bracing that once protected you can also quietly block you from noticing good things when they finally arrive, because you have trained yourself to expect disappointment as the default outcome. I am not asking you to abandon wisdom or to trust recklessly. Discernment still matters, and I am not suggesting you ignore real warning signs simply because you want to feel hopeful. What I am asking is that you loosen your grip just slightly on the assumption that things will always go wrong, enough to actually notice when something goes right. Otherwise, you risk walking straight past genuine improvement because your guard was raised so high that nothing good could register as real. I want to talk about the specific relationships in your life that this difficult season may have tested, sometimes revealing which connections were genuinely solid and which were more fragile than they initially appeared. Difficult seasons have a way of clarifying relationships in ways that easier seasons often do not. People who show up consistently during genuine difficulty reveal something true about the depth of their care. people who quietly disappear during hard seasons reveal something true as well, even if that truth is disappointing to accept. I want you to consider, honestly, which relationships in your life actually held steady through this difficulty, and which ones revealed themselves to be less durable than you had hoped. This is not an invitation to become bitter toward the people who disappointed you during a hard season. People have their own limitations, their own struggles, their own capacity that sometimes falls short of what we needed from them, and that shortfall does not always mean malice or indifference. But it is worth noticing honestly which relationships proved genuinely reliable, because those are likely the relationships worth investing more deeply in as you move forward. I want to speak now about the specific grief that can accompany realizing certain relationships were not as solid as you once believed. That grief is real, and I do not want to minimize it by rushing past it towards simple acceptance. It is genuinely painful to discover that someone you counted on was not actually as present as you needed them to be during real difficulty. I want you to let that grief exist, honestly, while also allowing it to eventually inform how you invest your relational energy going forward, rather than repeating the same pattern of over-investing in connections that consistently fail to show up when it matters most. I want to talk about the specific relationships that did hold steady, the people who genuinely showed up for you during this difficult season, even in small, quiet ways that may not have felt dramatic at the time. I want you to notice those people specifically, and to consider expressing gratitude toward them directly, if you have not already done so. Genuine support during real difficulty deserves acknowledgement, both because the person offering it deserves to know it mattered, and because naming that support helps you fully register its significance rather than letting it pass by unnoticed, the way so many good things unfortunately do during difficult seasons. I want to speak now about what it might mean to begin trusting again after a difficult season has tested your capacity for trust. Both trust in other people and trust in your own judgment about circumstances and decisions. Trust rebuilt slowly, through small, low-stakes moments of openness rather than one dramatic leap, tends to hold up considerably better than trust forced back into place all at once before it has had time to genuinely stabilize. I want you to be patient with your own capacity for trust as it gradually rebuilds, rather than expecting yourself to trust as freely and easily as you may have before this difficult season began. I want to talk about hope specifically, because I suspect hope has felt considerably riskier to you throughout this storm than it once did earlier in your life. Hope that has been disappointed repeatedly starts to feel dangerous, almost foolish, like deliberately setting yourself up for more pain. I understand why guarding against that feels safer than continuing to hope openly, but I want to gently challenge the idea that protecting yourself from hope entirely is actually protecting you from anything real. A life lived without any hope at all is not actually safer. It is simply smaller. And you were never meant to live small, simply because this particular season hurt you deeply. I am not asking you to hope recklessly, ignoring genuine patterns or real warning signs from your past experience. I am asking you to leave a small amount of room, even now, for the possibility that not everything you hope for is destined to be disappointed the way some of your past hopes were. Some of what you are hoping for as this season begins to pass is genuinely going to arrive, and I would rather you notice it clearly when it does, than have trained yourself so thoroughly against hope that you cannot recognize a real improvement, even standing directly in front of you. I want to speak now about patience as a practice, rather than simply a passive state, because I think it is often misunderstood as merely enduring without complaint. Real patience involves continued effort alongside continued waiting. It means still showing up, still trying, still taking small steps forward, even while the larger resolution of this season remains unclear. That kind of patience is far more demanding than passive waiting, and it deserves genuine respect rather than being dismissed as simply doing nothing while time passes. I want to talk about setbacks specifically because I do not want to suggest that once this season genuinely begins to pass, everything moves forward smoothly without any further difficulty ever again. Setbacks are a normal part of almost every process of genuine recovery, not evidence that the recovery itself was never real to begin with. If you experience a setback in the coming weeks, even after genuinely believing something had shifted, resist the urge to interpret that setback as proof that nothing actually changed. Recovery from a genuine difficulty is rarely a straight upward line. It tends to move forward with occasional dips and pauses along the way, and those dips do not erase the genuine progress made before them. I want to speak about identity once more, because I think it deserves repeated emphasis, given how much difficult seasons can distort a person's sense of who they actually are. During genuine hardship, it is common to begin defining yourself primarily by the difficulty itself. To start thinking of yourself as simply someone who struggles, someone whose life is defined by whatever season currently surrounds them. I want you to gently resist that narrowing of identity. You are considerably more than this current season, even while you are genuinely in the middle of it. The season is something happening to you and around you. It is not the entirety of who you actually are. I want to talk now about what specifically might help you hold onto that broader sense of identity while still genuinely acknowledging the real difficulty of this season. Consider the parts of yourself that have nothing directly to do with the current difficulty, interests you have, relationships that exist outside the struggle, values you hold that remain constant regardless of circumstances. Tending to those parts of yourself, even in small ways, even briefly, can help remind you that you are not simply defined by whatever you are currently enduring. I want to speak honestly about the specific temptation to give up right before a difficult season actually begins to clear, because that particular moment right before change becomes visible is often the hardest one to endure. It is the point where you have already invested so much patience and effort that continuing feels almost unbearable, while you still cannot see any concrete evidence that your effort is about to pay off. If you find yourself in that exact moment right now, I want you to know that the temptation to quit does not automatically mean you have misjudged your situation. It often simply means you are closer than the discouragement in front of you would suggest. This is not a guarantee of a specific timeline, but it is a genuine reason to keep going one more day. One more attempt, one more honest step forward, even without full certainty about exactly when relief will actually arrive. I want to speak plainly about forgiveness now, both toward other people and toward yourself, because I suspect this season has left you carrying resentment in more than one direction. Forgiveness does not mean pretending something did not hurt you, and it does not mean allowing someone back into your life who has shown no real change or accountability. It simply means loosening the grip that a past wound has over present peace. I also want you to consider forgiving yourself for whatever mistakes you may have made during this difficult season. Decisions you now see differently in hindsight. Moments you were less patient or less gracious than you wish you had been while under real pressure. You were doing your best with the resources you had available at the time, even when that best fell short of what you might expect from yourself in easier circumstances. I want to talk about the version of yourself that existed before this particular season began, because I suspect there are moments you quietly miss that earlier version, the one who trusted more easily, who worried less about the possibility of further difficulty, who had not yet learned to brace so heavily against disappointment. You are not required to return to exactly who you were before, as though everything you have lived through since then was simply damage that needs undoing. Some of what you have become through this hardship is genuinely more solid than what existed before it, even if it does not always feel that way in quieter, more vulnerable moments. I want to speak now about what it means to actually trust a process you cannot fully see the end of yet. Trust like that is difficult, especially for someone who has learned through hard experience that things do not always work out the way they were hoped to. I am not asking for blind trust that ignores reality or refuses to acknowledge genuine difficulty. I am asking for a steadier kind of trust, one that can hold both truths at once, that things are genuinely hard right now, and that something meaningful is still unfolding underneath the difficulty, even before it becomes fully visible. I want to talk about the specific relief of finally being able to rest a little more fully as this season begins to pass. Now that some of the pressure to constantly brace for further difficulty may begin easing slightly. I do not mean that you should abandon wisdom or become careless about genuine risks. I mean that the exhausting sense of needing to remain in a constant state of defensive vigilance can begin to soften as evidence accumulates that circumstances are genuinely improving. That softening is not permission to become reckless. It is simply permission to stop carrying quite so much defensive tension, trusting instead that you can respond to whatever comes next without needing to remain perpetually braced for the worst. I want to speak about gratitude once more, because I think it deserves to be revisited rather than mentioned only briefly. Gratitude during a difficult season is not about pretending everything is fine when it is not. It is about noticing, honestly, whatever small good things genuinely exist alongside the difficulty, rather than allowing the difficulty to completely eclipse everything else in your field of vision. This kind of gratitude does not deny the reality of the season. It simply refuses to let the season become the only thing you are capable of seeing. I want to talk now about what legacy might mean in the context of this particular season, because I think you have likely underestimated how the way you have handled this difficulty might be influencing people around you, even without your direct awareness of it. When you choose to keep functioning through genuine hardship, when you choose patience over bitterness, when you choose to remain fundamentally kind, even while exhausted, that choice does not only affect you, it quietly shapes the people watching you. Sometimes people you are not even thinking about in the moment you make that choice. Your children, if you have them, absorb more from watching you endure difficulty with grace than from almost anything you explicitly teach them in calmer moments. Friends and colleagues are influenced more by what they observe you actually do under real pressure than by any advice you might offer during easier times. I want you to carry that knowledge gently, not as additional pressure to perform resilience flawlessly at all times, but as a quiet reminder that your endurance through this season has value extending well beyond your own personal experience of it. I want to close this reflection with one final, honest thought, before moving towards some practical closing guidance. Everything shared here rests on a truth that was true long before this message reached you, and will remain true long after you finish reading it. You are someone who has continued functioning through genuine difficulty, repeatedly, across a stretch of time that has genuinely tested you. That perseverance, sustained through real hardship, has built something valuable in you. Something that was never actually dependent on the season ending quickly in order to matter. Whatever comes next, as this season eventually passes, is simply the natural continuation of a foundation that has already been quietly, faithfully established through everything you have already endured. I want to leave you with a few simple, practical things worth holding on to in the days ahead. Because insight alone rarely sustains a person through an ordinary difficult afternoon when the weight of this season resurfaces unexpectedly. Notice the small signs of change rather than only watching for something dramatic and undeniable. A conversation that goes better than expected. A moment of unexpected calm. A quiet sense of internal steadiness about a situation that once felt completely overwhelming. These are not insignificant. They are often the earliest signs of a season genuinely beginning to pass. Give yourself permission to rest without guilt, recognizing that enduring real difficulty is genuinely demanding work deserving of real recovery. Be patient with how gradually resolution tends to unfold, understanding that lasting relief is rarely built or received all at once. Keep speaking honestly, both to yourself privately and, where it feels safe to do so, to people who genuinely understand and value what you have carried through this season. And finally, keep returning to this quiet, steady truth for as long as you need it. What you have endured through this season was never wasted. Even during the stretches, it felt that way. It mattered then, and it continues to matter now as whatever comes next gently begins to unfold around what you have already quietly, consistently survived. Take a breath. Let your shoulders drop just slightly from wherever they have been holding tension without you fully noticing it. You have already demonstrated repeatedly exactly the kind of endurance that difficult seasons require. That track record means something real. Carry it with you gently into whatever comes next, trusting that the relief you have quietly waited for is finally beginning to catch up to the perseverance you have already faithfully maintained. I want to speak a little more about what this quieter shift might actually feel like as the season continues passing, because I think it is easy to imagine relief as something loud and dramatic, when in reality it often arrives in far smaller, steadier forms. It might look like a decision that once felt impossible suddenly becoming clear. It might look like a relationship you had quietly worried about beginning to settle into something more stable. It might look like nothing more dramatic than a growing sense of internal steadiness. A quiet knowing that whatever comes next, you have already proven capable of facing it with genuine resilience rather than complete despair. I want you to hold space for all of these possibilities rather than narrowing your expectation down to only one specific form relief must take in order to count. Sometimes the most meaningful resolution is the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your own sense of security rather than arriving as a dramatic external event. That quiet kind of resolution tends to last considerably longer than anything more dramatic, precisely because it does not depend on continued external validation to remain true. I want to talk now about what it means to keep growing, even after this season passes, because I do not want you to mistake the passing of this season as a finish line rather than a continuing process. Growth is not something achieved once and then permanently secured. It continues to require the same quiet, consistent choices that built it in the first place. Patience chosen again tomorrow, kindness extended again in the next difficult moment. The relief arriving now does not exempt you from continuing that same quiet growth going forward. If anything, it simply confirms that the growth has genuinely been worth pursuing all along, and that confirmation can become fuel for continuing, rather than a reason to relax entirely into complacency. I want to speak plainly about the fear that once this relief arrives, you might somehow lose it through a single difficult moment or a single setback that tests your resilience again. I want to address that fear directly. Genuine resilience, built through repeated difficult moments over a long period of time, is not erased by a single moment of renewed struggle. You are allowed to have difficult moments even within this season of relief. What matters is the overall pattern you have established, not flawless, unwavering strength in every single moment going forward. I want to talk about humility for a moment, because I think it deserves careful attention as you move through this transition. Genuine humility is not the same as refusing to acknowledge that your endurance mattered. It is possible to recognize honestly that what you have survived has been significant while still remaining grounded, still remaining aware of how much effort it required, still remaining grateful rather than entitled about whatever relief arrives. I want you to hold both of these truths together, that what you have endured genuinely deserves acknowledgement, and that receiving that acknowledgement well requires continued groundedness, rather than any shift toward assuming you are now owed something simply because you have survived difficulty. I want to close this reflection with one final, honest thought. Everything shared here rests on a truth that was true long before this message reached you and will remain true long after today ends. You are someone who has consistently continued functioning through genuine difficulty when giving up would have been fully understandable. That endurance, sustained across a genuinely difficult season, has built something real in you. Something that was never actually dependent on the season's timeline in order to matter. Whatever begins unfolding as this season passes is simply the natural continuation of a foundation that has already been quietly, faithfully established. Carry that truth gently into whatever comes next. You do not need to force relief to arrive faster than it naturally will. You simply need to continue being who you have already consistently, faithfully shown yourself to be, trusting that whatever is already beginning to unfold will continue to reveal itself clearly in its own time, exactly as it has already begun to do. Wherever you are reading this, whatever room, whatever moment of your day this happens to be, let it settle into you fully before you move on to whatever comes next. You are not required to feel completely different immediately. You are simply invited to remain a little more aware of what you have already built through sustained endurance, trusting that whatever is unfolding will continue to reveal itself. Patiently, one honest day at a time. Starting from right now, I want to add one final thought before this closes completely. Whatever specific relief you have been hoping for throughout this season, hold it with open hands rather than a tightly closed fist. Genuine endurance does not require you to dictate the exact shape resolution must take. It simply requires you to remain genuinely open to receiving whatever form that resolution actually arrives in, trusting that what unfolds will ultimately serve you better than the narrower version you may have originally pictured. You have already proven, through everything you have walked through, that you are capable of enduring without needing every detail explained in advance. Carry that same capacity forward into whatever comes next. Let it be enough, once again, exactly as it has already been enough to bring you this far through everything this season has required of you. I want to speak once more briefly about what it means to keep believing that something good is possible for you, even after everything you have already endured. Belief like that does not require certainty. It does not require you to have every reason clearly mapped out in advance. It simply requires a willingness to remain open, even slightly, to the possibility that your story is not finished, that the difficult chapters you have already lived through are not the entirety of what your life will eventually contain. That willingness, quiet as it is, matters more than you likely realize. It is often the very thing that allows a genuinely new season to actually take root in your life, rather than simply passing by unnoticed the way so many ordinary days already have. So let this settle into you gently one final time, before you close this message and move forward into whatever the rest of your day holds. You have carried enough for long enough. Something lighter is genuinely allowed to begin now, and you are allowed to let yourself believe that one honest step at a time, for as long as it takes to feel solid beneath your feet again.